Given us some information relative to the African world, the scattering of Africans literally all over the world. And of course, Dr. Madu, before we left, you were giving us an overview in terms of where Africans, for the most part, are situated. And I must say that they are situated in such numbers that we never realized that, that they might have been there, but we certainly didn't realize that you're talking about the hundreds of thousands in these particular areas. Let's continue that.
Well, how are these Africans treated, you know, in the countries where they currently reside in terms of political and, you know, social order? For example, let's take the case of Dominican Republic.
Okay.
Take the case of a guy called Jose Francisco Peña Gomez. Peña Gomez was a long-time mayor of Santo Domingo, you know, the capital. His parents were Haitian, you know, so he's very black, you know. But he was the most popular politician in the country. He was a member of a Socialist International, a close friend of former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, you know. He ran for election a few years ago against, you know, an icon in Dominican Republic called Balagua, who has been president for a long time. He won the election. Everybody knew he did. But because they didn't want a black president, you know, they rigged the election against him. 4 years later, he ran against a nobody in Dominican politics, you know, called Leonel Fernandez. Everybody knew that Peña Gomez won, but they rigged it to prevent him, because of his skin, of becoming president of the country. So in a country even like the Dominican Republic, that's predominated by blacks and mestizos. Yeah, the mestizo elite still looks down on the blacks. You know, in the Spanish colonies, you know, the mixed blood, they call them mestizos, or the British call them mulattoes. So the mestizos in Dominican Republic, you know, yeah, think they are superior to dark-skinned Haitians. You know, that's an example. In Colombia, you have about 5 million blacks, you know, but what happened, or what has been happening, is that the official census never counted blacks in the country. Okay. He never did.
So they're not visible. They're invisible for all practical purposes.
Exactly. They're invisible for all practical purposes. Okay? There are about 4,000 and some legislators, 80 are black in the country. Okay. Now, take the example of Peru. The same. Most of the menial jobs and all that are reserved for blacks only, you know, second only to the indigenous group. That was what gave rise, you know, to a guerrilla warfare that lasted a whole lot of years, called the Shining Path. You know, that was a rebellion of the indigenous people against the hegemony of the white elite. You go to Ecuador, the same. They're relegated to the worst, you know, menial jobs, no civil rights. You know, the only way a black person could be recognized in Ecuador is if you're a soccer player.
That's the only
exactly, only avenue of social mobility. You know, in Cuba, even as hard as the socialist revolution, you know, tried to equalize, you know, the racial, you know, imbalance, you know, by trying to promote a whole lot of blacks. But still, if you look at the Cuban National Assembly or the Cuban Politburo, you hardly see any blacks in there. In fact, one of the highest ranking blacks in the country was Theophilus Stevenson, you know, who was heavyweight champion for a long time, Olympic this and So apart from him, you have very few blacks of standing in Cuba, despite attempts by Fidel Castro, you know, to rectify that. In Argentina, blacks are highly invisible, you know, because the country pretends that you don't have them. It's a white, lily white country. Yeah, but the World Bank stated that at least there are about 2 million Afro-Argentines in the country.
Well, and they say that there's none at all.
That's correct, there's none at all. Okay, yeah. In Chile, the same. Chile claims to be the whitest country, you know, in the whole of Latin America, but they are Africans living in Chile. You know, in Costa Rica, yeah, almost half of the population are blacks, but they are discriminated against too, even when President Oscar Arias tried to pass legislation, you know, to ameliorate it. What is happening in that part of the world, in South America, is that half of the countries deny that racism exists, and there are no laws at all to rectify them. For example, in Venezuela, they say, well, there's no laws against it, so there's no racism at all. But now Hugo Chavez is trying to take a look to see, hey, you know, something's happening here. You know, we have to create some laws to protect, you know, people against discrimination. But the fact is that for centuries, they've always used that as an excuse to say, well, it doesn't exist in our society the way it exists in the U.S. Just because we don't have laws here, you know, but you all have laws against it there, you see. So, but the difference is that we have laws that regulate it, that control it. In those countries, they just, you know,
just
it's subliminal, exactly. Just leave it alone, exactly. But the problem is that most of the black citizens in those countries have not organized themselves because they've not been politically sensitized. You see, because they are poorly educated, they lack the resources and all that that African Americans had here to fight, you know, for civil rights. And moreover, the slave trade and slavery lasted longer in Latin America than it did here. So after it ended, you know, the slow pace of changes, you know, is hard to come by. And that's precisely what is happening now, you know. So in some countries, they are trying to pass legislation to control it. But then centuries-old habits, you know, die hard. In Nicaragua, the same thing. You know, the new president, you know, is trying to pass some laws against discrimination against blacks, you know, who live in Bluefields and all these places. El Salvador, the same. You know, they try to, they don't have laws against it because they deny
that it exists.
That it exists in their society.
So you can't pass a law against something that doesn't exist.
You see, yeah, in Honduras, the Garifuna blacks are, you know, rebelling very hard now against discrimination against them. See, so. But then go to the Middle East, it's a different story. Yeah, most of them say, well, you know, under Islam and under Allah, everybody's equal. Yeah, but underneath, blacks in those societies have been discriminated heavily. Yeah, even in Libya. Libya's Colonel Gaddafi wants to be, you know, the leader of all Africa. But in his country, his people were slaughtering, you know, blacks, and he didn't do anything about it, than expel them.
Okay, and of course, Dr. LMadu, we're getting ready for our second commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll continue this. But it is surprising that Africans are scattered, literally scattered all over the world, as you're indicating, yet there's one thing that's central, and that is discrimination against them wherever they are. Of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. We're talking to Dr. LMadu.